Unit 11, page 2. In this lecture, we'll talk about feeding relationships, how organisms get energy, and why they rely on each other. So to start us off, let's start thinking about how organisms actually get energy in order to live. What are some ideas? Hopefully you've already thought about the fact that organisms need to eat. Plants, on the other hand, can make their own energy through the sunlight. So now let's get into specifics about each different kind of organism. Now, the main source of energy for the entire ecosystem is the sun. Remember, sunlight is a form of light energy, also heat energy, that provides food for the plants. Plants we also call producers or autotrophs. Those two words are used interchangeably on this Regents, so make sure you know both. It's defined as an organism that uses the energy in the sun to make food, glucose, for themselves to provide energy for the rest of the ecosystem. So we call them the producers because they're really taking the energy from the sun and producing food for everybody else. Autotrophs means the same thing. Think about the word auto means self, like an autobiography. Trophs means feeder, so they're a self-feeder. They make their own food. There are other organisms, though, that can't make their own food. We call these either consumers or heterotrophs. Again, those two words mean the same thing, but you should know both. It's defined as an organism that can't make its own food and has to feed on something else, like a plant or even another animal. So the heterotrophs, or consumers, depend on the autotrophs for their energy. Heterotrophs can have a number of different feeding relationships. So the first of them is called an herbivore. Herbivore basically eats plants. We also call them primary consumers. Primary meaning first. It's the first organism to get energy from the plants or the producers. Carnivores is the next level. We call this secondary or tertiary, meaning second or third level of consumers. And basically, carnivores will only eat other animals. So they'll never eat plants, they will just eat other animals. Omnivores kind of mix it up. They eat a little bit of plants, a little bit of animals. Think of something like a bear. Also, there are organisms called scavengers. Scavengers eat any animals that have already died. So like a vulture would be an example of a scavenger. Decomposers break down all of these dead and decaying materials like plants and animals after they die and kind of fall into the soil. They break them down into the soil so that the trees and the plants can actually use that for energy to be recycled. So decomposers are really our recyclers. You can see the picture at the bottom. This is a form of mushroom, and decomposers oftentimes are fungus or some sort of mushroom-like substance. So whenever we talk about how organisms interact in terms of energy, we usually talk about food chains. And food chains just show the steps that show the flow of energy from one organism to the next. We always start with plants and then slowly work up the food chain. So notice we're starting with plants because they make the energy. Then we've got our primary consumer or herbivore, we've got our secondary consumer or carnivore, tertiary consumer, which is also carnivore, and then quaternary is the fourth, consumer or also a carnivore. So notice as we get to the secondary, these are all just carnivores going up. We're always going to start with plants, however, and plants, remember, are getting their energy from the sun. When we draw this out, when we write the food chain, we always have the plant starting, and then the arrow will always point to what eats the organism before. So berries get eaten by mice, mice get eaten by black bears. Notice that the arrow shows the energy flow. So this is the movement of the energy. The berries are giving all their energy to the mice are giving all their energy to the black bear. Food chains show feeding relationships, and we can see another one here. Basically, remembering that they all start with the sun, and then it goes to plants, And then after that, it goes up several levels depending on who's in that ecosystem, from primary consumer herbivore, secondary, tertiary, and even quaternary if necessary. Noticing here in this image that all of these organisms also have an arrow pointing down. What is that arrow pointing to? If we look in the bottom, remember anytime an organism dies, it gets recycled by the decomposers, which live in the soil. And then those decomposers give it back to the producers, and then they restart this cycle. So all levels are connecting to the decomposers. Now, even though we're getting energy and we're passing it along, sometimes we lose energy. So actually, every time a transfer of energy happens, when one organism gets eaten by another, we actually lose a little bit of that. So if you think of the plant has a lot of energy. It's created through photosynthesis from the sunlight, and the ladybug comes over, or the beetle comes over and starts to eat the leaf. Now, some of the energy that this bug actually is trying to get from the leaf, it's going to also be using for other things. Some of these things include growth, cellular respiration to make the energy, producing waste. I think it's a little cut off on the bottom, but all of these are different metabolic processes that are required for this beetle to live. All right. Sometimes we refer to it as loss of energy through heat because all of those activities consume heat. Food web is a little bit more complex of a picture in terms of how ecosystems are related. Think about food chains. If you had several food chains and you mixed them all together, that would be a food web. So a food web is much more complex, but it's also more realistic. An ecosystem will rarely ever have just a sunflower, a mouse, and a hawk, but it'll have a bunch of other organisms that all kind of feed on each other. So one organism in particular could eat multiple things. Maybe the mouse wouldn't necessarily just eat a sunflower, but it could also eat grass. In this example, we can see lots of different arrows going in all different directions. We're starting at the bottom here, the phytoplankton, the producer. We're sending that energy to these other organisms. And notice some organisms, like birds, are eating several different things. They're eating krill, they're eating the plankton, and they're eating fish, as well as squid. So all of these arrows are pointing towards the birds. That means the birds have a choice in what they choose to eat, and any other organism like humans also has a choice because they have 3 arrows pointing to them. So in summary, think about these 2 questions. First, what do you notice about all the arrows in the food webs below? Think about the direction they're going. What direction do they move and why? Take a moment, write your answer to that. So hopefully you identified the fact that the arrows are really pointing up. They're pointing towards the larger animals that are higher in the food chain. The energy is moving in the direction of the organism that's actually doing the eating. So whichever organism is eating it is being pointed to. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an introduction on feeding relationships in an ecosystem. Remember to check for understanding, write 2 insightful questions and their answers on the bottom of the page. Make sure that these are questions that you could potentially ask someone else to see if they really understood the content of the lesson.